back to my philosophy channel, The Philosopher's Diary. Today I'm going to be talking about Jean-Paul Sartre's Existentialism is Humanism. So what is existentialism? Well, let's say for example I'm thinking I want something to sit on. I think of a chair. Now I build this chair. In this case, the purpose of the chair, sitting, was thought of before the chair was created. In the same way, many religions believe that God chose a purpose for humans before he created them. Sartre, on the other hand, is an atheist, and so he believes that humans do not have a predefined purpose, but that we choose our own purpose. Quote, existence precedes essence. Sartre believes that humans exist before they have an essence. In Existentialism is a Humanism, Sartre addresses the complaints made by Catholics and communists. Catholics' critique of existentialism is that it is nihilistic, depressing, and leads to inaction because people can do whatever they want. Sartre believes that this is a misunderstanding of existentialism. The nihilism that Catholics are complaining about most likely stems from the transition from being a theist to an atheist. Because when people make that transition, they lose what was previously their life purpose. They lose this belief in a loving God, absolute morality, and an afterlife. And so because of that, oftentimes people who transition will fall into nihilism. But existentialism is not atheism. You can certainly believe in God and still be an existentialist. The second critique that Catholics make of existentialism is that it leads to inaction. But Sartre believes that existentialism scares Catholics and Christians because in religion there is this idea that if we just believe in Jesus Christ, our mistakes in the past will be remedied, that there is an afterlife, and so not as much weight is put on our actions in the here and now. In existentialism, the here and now is all we have. And so because of that, our actions matter so much more. The critique by communists that Sartre addresses is that existentialism is a bourgeois philosophy. In other words, it emphasizes the individual too much and ignores the collective, and thus is not a good blueprint for society. But Sartre would respond by saying that every action that we take as an individual shapes the image of humanity as a whole. Now I have 4 critiques of existentialism is a humanism. Number 1, furries. If human beings have no predefined purpose or definition, could humans choose to be animals? Critique number 2, neuroscience. Sartre says there is, quote, no human nature since there is no God to conceive of it, end quote. But why does this have to be? Can't there be a human nature or certain patterns that we observe in humans without a God? For example, cognitive bias. Cognitive bias is a phenomenon that is observed in humans where we tend to ignore certain evidence that contradicts a pre-existing worldview that we have, or we tend to engage in things like assumptions. And this could perhaps, according to some scientists, even be traced back to our origins. For example, if we lived in a forest and heard a bush rustle or saw a large shadow, it would be better to run and assume that there was a threat rather than to wait and see whether it's a threat or not. Thus, this would explain why our minds have a tendency to jump to assumptions very quickly rather than carefully analyzing every detail. Critique number 3 of existentialism is the existence of absolute morality. Sartre says that because there is no God, there is no absolute morality. But do we need God to have an absolute or a common morality? Could morality be deduced from logical principles or some other sort of formula? Do we absolutely have to have a God to have a common morality. Critique number 4 of existentialism: free will. Existentialism assumes that we have free will, but this is not a question that is settled even among scientists. For example, in the 1980s, Benjamin Libet did a study where he asked subjects to flex their right wrist at random and without planning. Brain activity was reported before the actual experience of flexing their right wrist. Chun Seong-soon and others asked subjects to choose between buttons and to hit immediately without planning. But using readings in the frontopolar cortex and the parietal cortex, scientists were able to predict with 60% accuracy which button the subject would choose. In another study with several scientists, whose names I will not attempt to pronounce, used depth electrodes, and they reported that, quote, a population of SMA neurons is sufficient to predict in single trials the impending decision to move, with accuracy greater than 80% already 700 milliseconds prior to subject's awareness, end quote. The question of free will and its existence is still highly debated among scientific communities, and it is certainly not settled. And so because existentialism's whole basis is on this assumed free will, I think existentialism falls into question. Anyways, that wraps up my video on Jean-Paul Sartre's Existentialism is a Humanism. Hope to see you soon. Please like and subscribe.